What is a nickel defense and why does it matter? If you're watching this video, there's a good chance you've had this question in your mind for a while. You've heard it on broadcasts, but you've been too embarrassed to ask. Don't be embarrassed to ask. Here's Brett Favre, Hall of Fame quarterback, telling a story from 1993 when he was a third-year starting quarterback in the NFL.
Sitting there going, I hear this nickel defense all the time, but I'm not real sure what it is.
So things have changed a lot since 1993. For one, Brett Favre was a freakishly gifted but somewhat immature young quarterback. He would grow to appreciate the importance of the nickel defense, but also it's become the dominant personnel grouping that's on the field in the NFL today. So some of these things are a little bit antiquated with the terminology. For those of you outside the U.S., this is the key thing to know. A nickel is our 5-cent piece. Got old Thomas Jefferson on there, but it's worth 5 pennies. That means it's 5 times less completely worthless than the worthless penny. But that number 5 is critical when we discuss the nickel defense. Here's Brett Favre again talking about when he posed this question to his backup quarterback, Ty Detmer.
What's nickel defense? He just real quiet. He says, "You serious?" I said, "Yeah, I'm serious." He says, "Well, they basically take out a linebacker and bring in a DB." I said, "That's it?"
Yeah, that's it, which means that you have 5 defensive backs. So 5 cents, 5 defensive backs. It's a defensive package where you have 5 defensive backs. We're going to look at the Browns versus the Texans in the wild card game this year. Now, this is the important thing to remember. I'm going to call this their base defense. This is a 4-3 defense. And the one thing where the terminology is a little bit antiquated is that, again, teams spend more time in nickel than in their base defense. And the base defense used to mean, hey, this is the defense that's on the field the most often. Now it's more, think of it as the basic structure of the defense. So a 4-3 defense has 4 defensive linemen right up at the front there. And then you've got 3 linebackers. So that's where the 4-3 comes. And when you have 4 defensive linemen, 3 linebackers, that leaves 4 spots that are defensive backs. The key thing to remember about the defensive backs is that they are the fastest, most athletic guys on the defense. So if we look at their nickel defense, remember, you got to get to 5 defensive backs. You're going to have those same 4 defensive linemen. Instead of 3 linebackers, you're going to take one of those guys out. You're going to have 2 linebackers. And that leaves this guy to come in, your nickel back, who tends to be a defensive back, either a corner or a safety. The other 4 defensive backs are still out there. You've got 5 defensive backs, your nickel defense. So 5 defensive backs on the field, that's a nickel defense. And if you know from high school or college, especially, they'll just call it a 4-2-5 defense often. There's reasons why they don't do that in the NFL, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But first, the most critical question, probably the same question that Brett Favre has right here.
I said, "That's it?" He said, "That's it." I said, "Who gives a shit?"
Indeed, who gives a shit? Again, this was 1993, and Brett Favre would go on to be a much more intelligent and educated quarterback in his career, but it really just all comes down to matchups, and 100% of modern NFL quarterbacks absolutely know what nickel defense is because those 5 defensive backs matter. The reason you have 5 defensive backs on the field is because you're trying to match up to the skill set of the offense. So we look at that Browns base defense again, that 4-3 defense where you've got 4 defensive backs. They're matching up to a Texans offense that has 2 wide receivers on the field. So the Browns have 4 super athletic defensive backs. The Texans have 2 wide receivers. They're most athletic and fastest players. When you go to the Browns nickel defense, where you have 5 defensive backs, well, the reason they're out there in that personnel grouping with 5 super athletic dudes is because the Texans came out with 3 wide receivers on the field. So as a quarterback, you're looking at what the defensive personnel is that can match up versus your wide receivers, your tight ends, your fullbacks. And if you're able to get a wide receiver on a linebacker, that's typically a pretty big mismatch. You're less likely to get caught in that bind as a defense if you're in your nickel defense. Now, in the old old days, again, things have changed a lot over the past 10 or 15 years. Somebody might tell you, well, you're out in nickel defense because you anticipate pass. The difference these days is that offenses can be just as likely to run out of their 3 wide receiver formations as they are to pass, depending on situations and game planning and all of that. And that's where the chess match really starts to begin. The one wrinkle here in how you swap out your base defense for your nickel defense is if you run a 3-4 defense.
You got this, you got 34, and but I was afraid to ask.
Don't be afraid to ask. You might have said, well, what the hell's a 3-4 defense? And why does that matter? I got you covered right here. If we're going to look at a 3-4 defense, remember the 4-3 defense was 4 defensive linemen and 3 linebackers. In a 3-4 defense, you've got 3 defensive linemen. You've got 4 linebackers, a 3-4 defense. But what they'll do is instead of swapping out a linebacker, typically they'll take a defensive tackle out of the game, usually your nose tackle. And then what you end up having is, in this picture of the Steelers nickel defense, you'll have 2 guys who are named defensive linemen on the depth chart playing on the defensive line, but then they have 4 linebackers, which leaves us with the 5 defensive backs in your nickel defense. And this is where it gets confusing because really the difference in this defense is that your 2 outside linebackers are guys that we call tweeners. They're somewhere in between an outside linebacker and a defensive end in terms of their physical skill set. And that's one of the reasons these days people more and more are accurately calling these guys edge players instead of linebackers or defensive linemen. But from the offensive perspective, when you look at the defensive line and the linebackers, it looks just like that 4-2-5 that we talked about earlier. So that's the very simple and basic way to remember it is just 5 defensive backs in nickel defense. And again, most NFL teams are going to show that a lot more than their base defense. Everything's a little bit antiquated, but look, in the NFL, it's hard to find universal terminology for things. Everybody likes to put their own spin on things, and this is the vernacular we still use. And I'll give you a little bonus lesson that goes alongside all of this.
Yardage situation, dime comes in. Like, dime? What the hell is dime?
This one's not going to make any logical sense to you at all, but a dime defense is where you have 6 defensive backs. So it made sense when you have 5 defensive backs to have nickel. Dime, you're adding a defensive back, so you go up 1 denomination. For those of you outside the U.S., dime is 10 pennies. So it doesn't make any logical sense, but this is American football, baby. And there are teams that in certain games will play more dime defense than any other defense. So among the many things that have changed since 1993, the passing game has just exploded, and you simply need more defensive backs on the field more often than back in the old days. I'm Seth Payne, played 10 years in the NFL, and I do sports radio in Houston on Sports Radio 610 every single weekday morning. And you can follow me here by subscribing. Hit the subscribe button, share, tell a friend, all of that. Thanks, everybody.